torture device designed to kill people in the slowest, most painful way possible. In this video, we're looking at the Iron Maiden, known to be the worst form of punishment in the history of mankind. The existence of the Iron Maiden is pretty perplexing, and no, we're not talking about the world's greatest heavy metal band right now. While there are no actual accounts of this device being used to punish criminals and prisoners back in medieval times, there's certainly plenty of evidence that points to their existence, and we owe it all to a man named Matthew Peacock. Peacock spent his life collecting old paintings and gizmos. After taking a deep dive into the medieval era, he managed to piece together what we know now as the Iron Maiden. So, what exactly did this torture device look like, and what did it do? The Iron Maiden was essentially a casket with spikes on the inside, so that when it would be closed, the spikes would slowly dig into the victim's body, impaling them on the spot. The form of torture is said to have originated in Germany. The Iron Maiden was designed for both torture and execution. The device featured two sets of spikes. The longer ones would immediately pierce the victim as soon as the lid was closed. These would stab through their wrists and ankles, crucifying and nailing the person down so they couldn't move or push back. Then the shorter spikes would push into their thighs, shoulders, and arms. Now, if you notice, none of these spikes stab areas like the heart that would directly kill the victim. Why? Well, because the point was to punish them with a slow, torturous death, keeping them in pain for the longest possible time. Then, with one final push, the lid of the device would press down with the smallest spikes, penetrating the victim's eyes, throat, and then going into his heart and brain, finally putting an end to the agony. Rumor has it that the device was actually just an interaction of a 2,200-year-old device described by the Greek historian Polybius, who wrote about the 2nd and 3rd century Spartan leader Nabi, who loved his wife Apega so much that he had a metal replica of her made. But what's strange is that the replica wasn't just for display. The arms and hands along with the breast of the replica were covered with iron nails. Whenever someone would refuse to pay their taxes or commit a crime, they would be forced to give the metal structure a hug until they died or paid up. But the tricky part is that there are practically no historical accounts of the Iron Maiden actually being used. The earliest record that points to the existence of the device dates back to the 1700s, when German philosopher Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote about a coin forger being executed using the Iron Maiden. And that's when museums all over Europe and the USA started imagining their own designs of the device and putting them on display. Speaking of Europe, there are plenty of folktales that speak of people being placed inside casks instead of caskets, with their heads poking out so that people could see them in their misery. Once the nails would be driven into their bodies and the torture began, the casks would be rolled down a steep hill and sometimes into the water, making the whole thing 10 times worse, leaving the victim withering in agony and pain as they died a slow death, either by the stab wounds or by the suffocation underwater. The only actual evidence of an Iron Maiden was sadly found partly destroyed by Allied bombers, but it was enough for the Museum of Crime in Rothenburg to replace the design and make a copy that showed exactly how the victims were tortured using this inhumane contraption with strategically placed spikes. And while the existence of the Iron Maiden might never be confirmed, if we know one thing about people in the Middle Ages, it's that they had a taste for torture. So there's really no reason for such a cruel device not to have been used back then, as terrifying as it was. That's a wrap for the Iron Maiden, worst punishment in the history of mankind. Do you think the Iron Maiden is a myth or something more than that? See you next time with something new, and until then, goodbye.